Hey there, everybody. Brad Geiger here with another episode of Webcomics Confidential. And today we're going to talk about some of the huge plate tectonic changes that have happened in webcomics that you haven't even noticed. If you're like, I'd say 90% of the webcomics that I see out there. The entire industry has taken an about face. And if you're still publishing webcomics the way we did it in 2010, you are really being left behind. If you're on autopilot, like most of us are, then you are really facing some serious risks in your approach, in what you're doing. So this is what I want to talk about. And it all starts here. Back in, by my estimation, the tipping point came around 2014. And that's when ad blockers became widespread. When even people like my mom knew what an ad blocker was and knew how to install it, it was all done for all of us who were doing a traditional webcomic. In the very beginning, going back to like the late 90s, early 2000s, we all told our readers, we told our audience as web cartoonists that we were delivering a free entertainment vehicle. This was something that was free webcomics. That was the rallying cry of the early 2000s, and it worked. It wasn't completely truthful, but as all good marketing claims, it was a shiny kind of polished up version of the truth. In truth, what we were offering was an ad-supported business model. This was something that we certainly was free on the side of the readers, but it was free by no means, because those readers were generating ad views that went in turn to pay our bills. We ran ads. We had multiple ads on our sites, usually a leaderboard across the top, something just below the comic. Maybe a footer at the bottom, maybe several more depending on the site that you're going to at the time. Many of us quickly learned to avoid ads like pop-ups and pop-unders and animated ads and ads that played music, whether you initiated it or not. But that presence of ads quickly became our bread and butter. I always like to tell the story when I'm talking about how I made my transition to a different business model. I talk about the fact that I was running 3 different ad networks, and one of those checks regularly paid my mortgage. And after 2014, it happened so slowly. It was such a slow constriction. Somewhere out there's a poster of a clown with a noose around his neck, watering a sapling, and the rope is attached to the sapling. I always use that as an example of what 2014 was to me, except at that point I didn't realize that my feet weren't on the ground anymore. It was a slow constriction as ad blockers slowly squeezed off our revenue stream. It got to the point in mid-2014 that same ad network that had been paying my mortgage wasn't even paying my electric bill. So at that point, I had to take a really strong look at what I was doing as a business person and adjusting. And the problem is that if you go out throughout webcomics right now, you see a lot of people who haven't realized that their feet aren't on the ground anymore when it comes to their ad revenue. So we need to talk about the fact that for the most part, by and large, for most of us, I can say with a great deal of confidence, ads are dead. Ads are dead, you guys. And if they're not dead for you now, they will be shortly, because as that continues to constrict, not only is it tightening the noose around our necks, but it's tightening the noose around advertisers' necks, those people that deliver advertising. And advertising is going to get, if you haven't noticed it already, in your own non-webcomics web traveling, advertising is going to get more and more aggressive. It's going to be more obstructive, and it's going to deliver a negative reading experience on websites. You already, if you're like me, there's a certain number of websites that you just don't go to anymore because you know you're going to have a negative experience based on the advertising that's going to block you from seeing the stuff that you want to see. I don't. I used to love Bleeding Cool. I used to rely on it for a lot of my information that I would keep up to date with comics information. If I see a Bleeding Cool link, the first thing I do is try to find that same information somewhere else, because I know that site is going to be a nightmarish delivery of advertising. Okay, so I don't go there anymore. You don't want that to happen to you. If ads aren't dead for you now, I can say with a great degree of assurance, unless something big happens, and believe me, there's a lot of stuff shifting out there in the landscape. Net neutrality is one of them. In case you haven't figured that out for yourself, net neutrality is going to affect you in a big way if that comes to pass. And it looks like net neutrality with the new FCC chairman is out. It's going to mean some other things that we're going to have to adapt to, folks. But right now, I think it's pretty easy to say ads are dead. So if you take that as an assumption, if you take that as a given, what does that mean? What does it mean that ads are dead? What does it mean that you are no longer running a viable ad-supported business with your webcomics? It actually means a lot of things. It means the entire, think about it. Webcomics as you know it, webcomics as has been built up from the late 90s through the 2000s into the 2010s up until 2017. Most of that experience, most of that evolution has been guided, has been dominated by the effect of advertising. We did everything that we did because it meant good ad money, you guys. That's why many of us in the early days were doing comic strips and stuff that we could update daily. More updates mean more ad views. More ad views mean more money. That's why the early part of webcomics is dominated by strips and panels, stuff that can be updated quickly. It's not the case anymore. That means that all of you folks that are what used to complain, it's so hard to do a long form comic on the web, this is so unfair. The time is right for long form comics. However, if you're still doing a long form comic the way long form comics were presented 10 years ago, you're failing. If you are putting the most recent page up on your site, you're right off the bat. That's something we did for ad views. That's something that we did to try to generate that kind of readership. Not only does that not work on an ad view basis, but the rest of the internet has changed due to social media, so people don't even read stuff that way anymore. All right? They don't hit bookmarks. They don't follow RSS. By and large, there's a few. God love them. Mainly, they're standing by the side of the stream on Facebook and Twitter and watching things float past and maybe jumping in and then binging. That's great news for a long-form comic. It should be evident to you. This is a great time for long-form comics. But if they come to your comic and they get plopped into page 12 of a 56-page story, and they've got no backstory, and they've got no relevance, they've got no context for what they're seeing, they are not going to stick around. They're going to jump right back out of the stream because there's more stuff happening on Facebook. That wasn't boring. All right? If you are presenting your long-form comic with the most current page up on the site, unless you are able to do that page, I'll put an asterisk right there. Put an asterisk. Unless you are able to deliver a self-standing reading experience in that page, unless I can come into that page with no former knowledge of your comic, read that page 12 and be satisfied if there's something there to satisfy me. And for humor, you've got an advantage there. You can tell a joke by that last panel and hook somebody, or something compelling. It's more difficult to do it in some of the other writing styles. But unless you can make that middle page, each one of those pages a freestanding, standalone reading experience that gets knitted into an overall storyline. Unless you can do that, if you're just putting your most recent page up on your site the way we did when we were trying to build ad views, then you are failing. You've got to completely rethink the way you're presenting your comic on the web. And that means most likely, if you're doing long form, a landing page. Duh. Plop them down into an introduction to your story. Not the middle of the story, an introduction to the story. And then what you should be doing is certainly pointing them towards different ways they can read your comic online, but the main thrust should be to either pointing them to a Patreon support or pointing them to where they can download very inexpensive ebooks, because that's the way people want to read long-form comics. They don't want to wait for an entire website page to load over and over again, even if their computer is fast, even if your website loads quickly. They want an ebook. That's the way to read a long-form comic, and everybody's got these digital devices now. They can run around and they can swipe their way through a page. By the way, long-form folks, that's great news for you. That's fantastic news for you. All right? So your website should be all about dropping them in, converting that reader, setting the hook, whether that means giving them a short piece of the story that sets the hook, an introduction, something, some narrative way to get them into that story, and then pointing them towards different ways they can indulge themselves in that story, different ways they can jump in, dive in, and find out more. And in my opinion, that should be pointing them towards very affordable ebooks that they can download and read. Your new long-form webcomic site should be an ebook sales site with a strong Patreon presence, in my opinion. But if you're doing things the way we did them in 2010, you are on autopilot, you're not paying attention to the world around you, and you are not doing as well as I think maybe you could be doing. Here's another thing. Going back to what I've already said a little bit, but underlining it. If you are tied into this idea of the daily update, I will also add another if to that. If that means that sometimes you're not putting your best work out there, but you're hitting that deadline with crap, the daily update was a construct of advertising model. We needed to, and it was also, I will say this, it was a little bit of a construct of the fact that social media hadn't really been invented yet, so we needed to make readers into habitual readers. And we needed to rely on them setting a bookmark or setting up RSS and things of that nature, a newsletter, all these other types of things. Now we've got social media. That's a much more powerful way to direct traffic, to tell people that you've got something new up. We don't rely on habitual readership anymore. And to be fair, I don't think habitual readership exists anymore. Not the way it did 10 years ago. Now it's much more, like I said, use that analogy of standing by the side of the stream and watching things float by and then jumping in and binging for a little bit. That is what readership is now. So why fight that? And in fact, why not take the positive things that are involved with that and run with them? In other words, why not say, I'm not necessarily going to do a daily update. Maybe I'm going to do 2 times a week. Maybe I'm going to do 1 time a week, and I'm going to pour all of that extra time into making that one update super, super good. Think about it. You don't need the daily update, not the way you did 10 years ago. Now, having said that, it's going to sound like a contradiction, but follow me. If you're building an audience, if you're starting out in your first couple of years, there is a lot to be said for frequent, consistent updates. I think that's still true, and that there's a lot of reasons for that. Not the least of which is that if you're really early on your learning curve, doing a great quantity of stuff, just banging it out, bang, 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 that is good for you. It's going to help you go up that learning curve more quickly if you're in the very starting out stages. And also, it doesn't matter because a lot of that early stuff is not going to be great because you're learning. Duh. You don't have the experience yet. That's okay. How do you think we all started? We all started doing crap and learning from that crap. It's just the way it is. And those of you who went to art school, I'm sure, heard the 10,000 bad drawings axiom, right? There's 10,000 bad drawings in your hand. Better get them out now. That's been repeated in art schools across the country. So I will say that frequent quick update schedule is very good when you're in the beginning stages. If you're a little bit further along, however, and if you've been doing healthy social media, if you've got a little bit of ability to direct traffic in that respect, and mind you, that's a lot different than what we were talking about yesterday when we were trying to use social media to build a audience or build an audience. This is about directing traffic, directing that existing audience, and hopefully growing our audience to the new updates. Those are two different things. And social media is very powerful in directing audience and getting the word out about a new update. That's what it's all about, right? So if you are, unless you're a beginner and you're doing the daily update because you think that's how webcomics are supposed to be done, you're on autopilot. You're not thinking about the actual world around you. And here's the other one, and you knew I was going to say this sooner or later. I've just been making you wait. But you know I'm going to start talking about Patreon, and you know that I'm going to start talking about exclusive content on Patreon. If you are treating Patreon like a tip jar, you're doing it wrong, is what I honestly believe. Unless you are offering significant exclusive content, that means content that your readers want to read. And unless you're doing that exclusively on Patreon, you are not paying attention to the actual business climate that you exist in. All right, this is not about casting a broad net anymore. This is not about generating large numbers of readers. This is about generating passionate readers. And this is about finding those things that your readers are passionate about to the extent that they're willing to sign up for a monthly subscription at the $1, $5, $10 and up level. And those higher levels do exist. I've said many, many times, there's a couple things that are absolutely true about Patreon. Number one, exclusive content works if it's exclusive content that your readers desire. Number two, frequent posting. That I took all that energy in from doing frequent posting on my website, and I poured all of that passion into Patreon, where it gets rewarded directly. All right, that's one place where the frequent updates actually do pay out. Because the more you post on Patreon, number one, the greater value or perceived value that your backers have. And number two, every time you post on Patreon, you better be running out to social media saying, hey, I just posted on Patreon. It's promotion. It's a double-edged kind of weapon that not only are you rewarding the people that are already on board, but you're reminding those other people that aren't on board yet why they should be on board. It's so exclusive content on Patreon. Patreon, in my opinion, is a subscription vehicle, and you should be using it as such. It is not a tip jar. It's not a charity. Those of you who are approaching this as a charity, putting out emotional requests. I'm a dad, I'm a wife, I'm a good person, support me on Patreon. I've always wanted to do comics since I was a little kid. No, what that Patreon backer wants to know is what's in it for me. What do I get for my money? Because I got news for you. You do not deserve a career in comics. You earn a career in comics, and you do that by giving people what they're willing to pay for. Sorry, that's just the way it is. And it's always been that way. All right? So, a long form, great news for long form. That means that this is a great climate for you, unless you're doing things the way we did them 10 years ago. Daily updates, no longer as important. Patreon, it's a subscription service. It is not anything but that, in my opinion. And yes, you do see people, listen, I do have like a tip jar tier in my Patreon? Of course. I'm not going to tell people that they can't give me $1 a month. I am absolutely going to use that, but that is not what's making the electric payments at the Geiger household. It is that those larger exclusive content tiers. And it also means, as long as we're talking crowdfunding, we should be talking about Kickstarter. And unless you're planning out and really, there's a great article on webcomics.com called Kickstarter Math. And it talks about the kinds of math that you need to do to really prepare properly for doing a Kickstarter. All right. If you're just looking at what it's going to cost, for example, to print your book, you are doing 40% of the actual math that you need to be doing. You're leaving out a whole lot of costs, and your Kickstarter has to cover your costs. And the other reason that I am really strong on Kickstarter is that you need to be using Kickstarter as market research. And if your Kickstarter is not going over, if your Kickstarter did not fund, notice I didn't say fail. There's no such thing as failure as Kickstarter. That's your readers saying, this has been nice, but I'm ready for you to do something else. This has been great, but listen, you guys, everything has a beginning, a middle, and an end. All right? This is another holdover. Now, we've been talking about all day about the holdover from the early days of webcomics. This, I think, is a holdover from the early days of comics publishing in general, right? And this can go back to mainstream superhero comics and newspaper comics. In that, somebody came up with one thing, Garfield, and then they did that for decades. Once they had their success, they cranked that baby out. They kept turning that wheel and churning out as much money with it as possible. Once you came up with your Spider-Man, you ran Spider-Man, even though you had to restart the storyline several times. You had to retcon and reboot and everything else, but you keep that Spider-Man. That is I think a lot of what we see here in webcomics is a holdover from that idea of coming up with one property and just cranking it out. If your Kickstarter did not fund, that means you may be at the end of a very natural creative life cycle for this property, and it may be time for you to start thinking about the next thing you're going to do. And that's not a failure. That's actually creative growth. It means you're done with this thing. Now you apply everything you learned with that thing to the next thing. Okay? And let's not forget that it also may mean that you're either the market's not ready for you or you're not ready for the market. So it might be your readers are getting ready for you to move on to something else. Might just mean that the thing that you did just wasn't ready for market. That, again, is not a failure. What it means is you've got to go back and take a look at why that might be. Why did this not fund? Maybe it's that there was something in it that was not ready for the market. The market was not willing to support it. So why is that? There's a lot of things, but there's so much useful information to come out of a Kickstarter that doesn't achieve its funding. There's no way you can call that a failure. Not if you're paying attention. Not if you're using that information. And believe me, I know it hurts like hell to see something like that not go over. It is a sense of frustration. Everybody wants their Kickstarters to go over. So yes, you are allowed to take a week or two and feel that pain and grieve that process. But then you've got to pick yourself up, put your big person pants on, and take a cold, hard, objective look at what happened and use that information. That's a painful part of creative growth, but absolutely it is creative growth. Okay, so Kickstarters not only as a way to bring in a certain amount of revenue and to have something that you can put out and sell on your site if you're doing distribution, if you've decided that comic conventions still provide a positive return on investment for you, and go back to the early Webcomics Confidentials for my thoughts on that. it gives you another revenue stream. And one thing that has stayed consistent in webcomics is that this has always been a business that was built on multiple revenue streams, bringing in lots of smaller revenue streams to create one big chunk of revenue at the end of the year. So, Kickstarter, valuable in so many ways, and you should be planning your Kickstarters throughout the year. You should have this on your calendar. Write it right down. I'm going to be getting printer quotes by this date. I'm going to be writing out my tiers on this date. And if you've got enough content, you should probably be thinking about doing multiple Kickstarters throughout the year. Because it's such a big part of what we do now. Crowdfunding's a big part of what we do. There's no way to get around that. And here's the last thing that I want to talk about, and it's something that slides right by everybody. Here's one of the huge things that the early web cartoonists had that you guys don't have, and that is a big archive. There was another byproduct of that frantic daily update schedule was by the end of a few years, you had a huge archive, and that archive was just sitting there out on the web generating passive income because somebody bumped into, February 16th, 2010 in the archives by some kind of, random Google search and discovered you. And if that comic was good enough, it grabbed them and they became a reader and so on and so forth. They're reading the archives, they're buying books, they're doing all that stuff. But most importantly, in this scenario, what they're doing is generating ad revenue. Having a huge archive was just a ripple effect of ever-expanding ad views. Lots of archive material meant lots of ad views. And that's something that going into 2014, before we started to see the tipping point, was very powerful for many of us web cartoonists. After 2014, after that tipping point, that big archive is just sitting there for all of us. It's just taking up space. There are a number of ways that I would suggest that we address this. If ad revenue is not as big of a part of your business as it was 2 or 3 years ago, you've got to take a look. And if you have a big archive, you've got to look at monetizing that archive in a different way because it's not generating ad revenue. So the fact that you've got it out there for free, and now it truly is free if it's not generating ad revenue, the fact that you've got it out there for free means you've got to now rethink what you're doing with it. That means you may have to start thinking about some things like, and here's one example, taking those archives offline and pushing those people who want to read that stuff into affordable ebooks, right? Take the first, I've got archives going back to 2000. It would be very easy, very doable to take all of 2000, for example, and turn that into an ebook for 99 cents. All of 2001, turn that into an ebook for 99 cents. Break it up by storyline, however you want to break it up. Break it up by the books that you've published in that time. You should be figuring out some way of monetizing that large archive because the ads aren't doing it. I would also say this, one of these days, someone is going to take that public Patreon API that they released 2 years ago, maybe more at this point, and they're going to figure out a way to make a Patreon login unlock a secure section of a WordPress website. Now, you see some people have been able to do this. Go look at Scott Kurtz's sites, PvP and Table Titans. They're not using WordPress. They're using a higher-end web publisher, but they are able to use that Patreon API so that when people are signed into Patreon, then they go to PvP, that sign-in is already noted, and it gets that, number one, it turns off all the ads on their site, and number two, it can unlock certain places of the website that is protected to non-subscribers. And of course, that is maintained on a daily, if not hourly basis. So if someone cancels their Patreon, then their access, all of the benefits that they get on the site, that becomes canceled as well. That has got to happen sooner rather than later for WordPress users. We've got to have a Patreon API key that allows us to block off certain parts of our site. And when that happens, and it's got to be soon, when that happens, then the next day you should have chunks of your archives that not only becomes blocked off, but it's not a negative, it's a positive. That doesn't become blocked off content. That becomes rewards for $1 a month patrons. All right? If you become a patron at $1 a month, not only do you get all this, bink, 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 remember it's all about what's in it for me, but now you get this huge chunk of archives that the general public doesn't get anymore. Again, it's all about you're replacing that ad money. It's not generating ad income anymore. That doesn't mean it doesn't have value. It means you have to valuate it different. Okay? That everything that I just lined up there is a complete 180-degree turn from where webcomics started. It's a huge difference. And as you can see, it permeates everything that we do. The whole idea of ads was in lockstep with how webcomics evolved. You take those ads out, and webcomics are going to continue to evolve, but they're going to follow a lot different paths than they did before. Now, not necessarily guided by advertising, but now guided by things like crowdfunding and social media. That's huge. And if you're still doing the same webcomic setup that you did 2 or 3 years ago without putting that thought into it, I think you're really being left behind, because there are some people that are out there doing it. And the more they follow that same line the same reasoning, the same path, I think they're going to do better and better, while people that do not pay attention to the changes that have happened right under their noses are gonna do worse and worse. I really believe that's the case. So that's our topic today. Ads have changed. Ads have shaped webcomics, and the lack of ads now have completely sent us into a 180. Not necessarily a bad thing, by the way. I will argue that the business model of webcomics today far supersedes the advertising-supported business model that we started out with. I think this is way better than it was back then. But that could be up for debate. So, you got an idea, you got a comment, you got a thought you'd like to share? By all means, come on over to webcomics.com, hit that comments. You'll find that there is no greater conversation, more respectful conversation on the web. It's something I'm very proud of. We can talk about some really intense issues and always remain respectfulness, and I appreciate that from you guys, and it's something that makes this site the quality site that it is. So that's our topic for today. Thank you so much. Hit the comments. Let me know what you think. This is Brad Geiger, and we'll see you next time.